is Dr. Matt Irvin at the University of South Carolina, and thank you all for joining us today on this webinar on policy-informed scholarship. I'm really excited about this webinar with the webinar committee. This is a one we've wanted to have for quite some time, so very excited to have Dr. Sharon Nichols to speak with us today about ways that educational psychologists may think about the connections between their scholarship and educational policy. So Dr. Nichols is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in research methods, learning theory, motivation, and development. She has authored over 36 books and many journal articles and book chapters related to youth development and motivation and educational policy. She's the editor of Educational Policies and Youth in the 21st Century and co-author of Collateral Damage, How High-Stakes Testing Corrupts America's Schools with Dr. David Berliner. Her current work focuses on the impact of test-based accountability on teachers and their instructional practices, as well as adolescent motivation and development. Welcome, Dr. Nichols.
So I want to thank Division 15 for inviting me to do this webinar. I also want to quickly thank David Berliner, Avi Kaplan, Michael Middleton, Ron Astor, and the members of the Policy and Practice Committee, all of whom have helped to shape my emerging thinking on this topic. I've benefited greatly from their wisdom and generosity in sharing their expertise. So anything that sounds really good, you can attribute to them, and anything that doesn't sound quite right, let's blame them as well. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is really a work in progress. Although I've been thinking about this topic for some time, transforming it into actionable and specific ideas is quite ongoing and emergent. I certainly don't have all the answers for how to do this yet, and there are definitely things that I have not thought of, so bear with me. But for now, I do want to share where my thinking has gotten me so far. The overall goal of this webinar is to start a conversation on how educational psychologists can involve themselves and/or their work into the educational policy arena. For the past few years, through conversations with colleagues, through the work I have been doing with Division 15, and through my personal work and experiences, I've noticed that there seems to be a growing interest in policy among our community. We in fact did a survey, some of you may have participated in some time ago, to gauge the temperature of Division 15 members. And it was overwhelmingly clear that members thought it was important that we, quote unquote, do more to impact policy. However, that of course raises an important question, which is, how do we do this? So what I'm going to talk about today reflects some of my thinking about how a group of quite diverse scholars might start to think about how to bridge their work and scholarship with policy. So here's what you can expect in the next half hour or so. First, I'm going to share a little bit about me and how I got here that will provide some kind of context on what I want to share. I'll talk a little bit about why I think we should do this, why I think it's an imperative that we do as a community think more about policy and the policy implications of our work. I'll also share some ideas that again are emergent for how we might do this, how we might conduct research for or about policy, ways we might translate our research for policy, and of course the very important area of how we might disseminate research for policy. I will also share a little bit about the activities of the Ad Hoc Policy and Practice Committee of Division 15 that will provide some information on ways members can get involved. And then, of course, we'll do some question and answers at the end, and hopefully we'll have some questions, and I will do my best to have some answers. Okay, so yes, I'm going to embarrass myself to get started, and I apologize, these pictures aren't great. But I'm doing so because I think they underscore, and I will get there, the theme of today's talk, that of dualities, or of opposing or competing viewpoints. Over time, my experiences and my identity has seemingly always straddled worlds that are very different. And therefore, my personal path has always seemed to involve a struggle over how to make sense of these worlds or how to bridge them. So as you can see from these not so good pictures, I was a softball player and I was a dancer. So my big hair aside, and I'll remind you, it was the 80s, these worlds did not go together. Dancers made fun of me playing softball. They thought I was too masculine. And funnily enough, the softball players made fun of me because I was too feminine. And in fact, I probably was, since I used to stand in 5th position on the mound when I was pitching. So moving forward, though, this dueling identity that I struggled with and experienced through my earlier years continued into the academic realm through grad school, into my postdoc and beyond. I had what I would consider to be quite typical educational psychology grad school experience. I got my master's and my PhD in the discipline of educational psychology. I got rigorous, high quality training and was exposed to many of the very traditional areas of educational psychology and educational psychology science and research. Motivation, different ways we think about motivation, learned about learning and cognition, learned a lot about teaching processes, and was exposed to the basics of assessment, statistics, and research. But then after graduate school, I experienced my postdoc, where I had the privilege to be mentored by David Berliner and Jean Glass. And it was here I spent a year taking a deep dive into educational policy, and specifically the testing provision of No Child Left Behind, which was relatively new at the time. Although I absolutely utilized the rigorous training of my graduate school experiences, I knew how to think critically, deeply. I knew how to apply research skills to my project. But I was thinking about a topic I hadn't necessarily trained for, that of policy. At the conclusion of this endeavor, and throughout the many years of my career, I've constantly felt that duality tug. Am I an educational psychologist? Am I a policy analyst? I didn't quite feel comfortable in either world. I would experience conferences and traverse both fields with regularity, but never felt fully immersed in either one. I spent a career working to make sense of these experiences, perspectives, and passions, and trying to understand how they work together to form a cohesive scholarly identity. And it's been a somewhat bumpy ride and an uncertain ride. So in the past few years, as I've progressed in my career, I embarked on an intentional endeavor to try to understand how to make sense of this. I wanted to better understand how educational psychology and policy fit together, and where I personally might exist among these two areas. I began by asking the question of, what does it mean to be an educational psychologist today? Who are educational psychologists? What is the status of the field? Maybe policy was already there and I just hadn't recognized it. I'd spent much more time in the policy realm in a variety of capacities over the years. So it was time to go back to my roots and really try to better understand where I came from and what this field was about. So I did this in two ways. One was to read essays by scholars who have recently produced retrospective essays of the field. At our 100th anniversary, it seemed a perfect time to do this. In reviewing these essays and kind of thinking through them, what I discovered was some of the main takeaways was that there was a series of dualities or competing orientations that seem to define the evolution of educational psychology. One is this notion of shifting worldviews or philosophical paradigms. The tension between the goals of our research to generalize to theories or populations, or to deconstruct and interrogate the role of local conditions. Another way to frame that would be sort of the tension between quantitative and qualitative research paradigms. Relatedly, is the goal to build theory, generate theory, and test theory, or is it to influence practice? It's not to say these two things are mutually exclusive, but they do have their different goals in our research quest. There also seemed to be a theme of focusing on outcomes, academics, motivation, what's the outcome of something, versus really interrogating the process, the underlying mechanisms that lead to outcomes. And then this notion of simplifying what is inherently complex in our work. And I gravitate to a quote from Berliner, who helped me to think about this idea. The teaching and learning that we study almost always takes place inside the intersection of teachers, by students, by task, by setting. Because of the immense complexity of what we study, we do not always design our research to explore the full four-way interaction that lies at the heart of the educational psychologist's interests. We do what scientists often do. We simplify in order to understand. So these tensions seem relatively pervasive over time and helped me take somewhat comfort that I'm not an oddball in engaging in or having myself sort of a set of dualities of my interests and my research work. Another way I tried to understand who we are as educational psychologists is I scanned our 3 Handbook of Educational Psychology volumes, dating back to 1996 and produced every 10 years so far. These represent a very rich, deep, and broad overview of our discipline and what we know in the realm of education. There's certainly a lot of information in here, but what I focused in on were retrospective essays that seem to exist in all of these volumes that commented on the status of the field at the time. And so I'm just cherry picking a few statements from those selections to exemplify another enduring tension that seems to pervade our discipline, which is research versus practice. In 1996, Calfee and Berliner wrote, "The Handbook of Educational Psychology presents a particular challenge, perched as it is between the discipline of scientific psychology on the one hand and the field of education practice on the other." And certainly throughout this particular essay, there's comments on how the history of our discipline really grappled with what is the ultimate goal of our scholarly work. And they don't always go together, and we've seemed to have vacillated over time, focusing on research versus focusing on practice. In 2006, Berliner writes, "Educational psychologists clearly have made important contributions to the study of transfer, memory, learning via technology, classroom management, bullying, group work, teaching, thinking, and dozens of other areas. But the scientific work for which we are justifiably proud seems not to translate easily into practice. Our scientific work often has implications for practice, but does not end up changing practice." And then most recently in the 2016 volume, past presidents of Division 15 collaborated and each provided their perspectives on past, present, and future of our discipline. And there's a lot in there, of course, and I'm boiling this down to a few simplistic points that help me think through what I'm trying to accomplish. And that is a comment from many of them, again, about the future of educational psychology needing to further consider the relationship of the science of educational psychology to the practical use of research in practice. Another comment and sort of enduring issue that these folks and others elsewhere have commented on is the concern over the relevancy of educational psychology. Have we produced research that is of such quality that other areas, other disciplines have now learned from us and therefore deem us to some degree irrelevant? That is one argument that Berliner has made over time. So there is this worry, what is our relevance? And we know there does seem to be a trend of teacher preparation programs somewhat starting to diminish our role in the work they do preparing teachers. So again, I think that's a question we need to be thinking about, a concern. And then we need to be thinking about changes in the methodologies we use in our science, that being too heavily bias towards quantitative paradigms, we might be losing our relevance in practice. Now that has been happening. There are many who have been doing that kind of research. I don't mean to say that we're not, but we continue to wonder how much of it, how much more can we do in that realm. So this takes me to the question then, this all leads up to this question of why should we do this? Why should educational psychologists think about policy in their work? Well, what I'm proposing is that we adopt or think about something I'm calling policy-informed scholarship, which I will be describing today. And a policy-informed scholarship framework can actually serve as a bridge between our research and the actual practices we aim to understand, describe, and influence. I see policy as the context in which teachers work, and therefore should be an important part of the research puzzle that we interrogate and study. So let's focus in on this question. Why? Why should we, as educational psychologists, think more about policy in the work we do? Very simply, because policy informs the practice that we want to understand and improve. So why? Policy informs practice. Now I have a few cartoons to kind of lighten up the talk. Policies create rules and parameters that teachers follow. School-wide programs create conditions, and teachers have to navigate, negotiate, and engage with those conditions. Educational psychologists can study this implementation or the effects on teachers, students, and administrators. Something like the idea that there's a gifted and talented program. How do schools manage that? How do they engage with that? What kind of messages are given to students? How do students interpret and internalize that? What information can we learn from that kind of research to help teachers and administrators do what they do better? Curriculum. Teachers follow a given curriculum, and curriculum is a form of policy. Sometimes that curriculum is incomplete, it's wrong, or it's inappropriate. So educational psychologists can use their research skills to examine curriculum, and many of us already do, of course. But to contextualize it into the policy arena would be another connection we can make to have more value in terms of how we want to influence policy. There are many policies that are simple mandates. They're very clear, they're very obvious, and they're very directive. Most of the time they're arbitrary, as in this silly example. Haven't you heard? The state now mandates that students do 35 hours of useful volunteer work. Well, even when they're based in good intentions, we know there are always consequences and unintended consequences. We can look under the hood of these types of mandates and describe how they get implemented and what effects they might be having. Of course, I have spent a lot of time thinking about a particular policy, that of high-stakes testing policy. In fact, this is the policy mandated under No Child Left Behind and continuing through to today, which we have lived with and throughout my entire professional career. This is what has had me wanting to understand how educational psychologists can be more a part of this lived reality for teachers. My entire career, educational contexts have been dominated by top-down, federally/state-imposed mandates that have had immense consequences on teacher practice and student outcomes. Under these onerous mandates, we know teachers have been asked to operate in ways they never would operate had it not been for high-stakes testing. So, because policy informs practice, I got this idea, and this is not a particularly provocative idea. I have seen this over and over again. High-stakes testing policies have fundamentally changed how teachers and students engage in schools. There is so much we have come to learn about the effects of this policy. It changes how teachers treat students, how teachers instruct, how general education teachers cope with academic diversity of their students. For example, in the special education realm, students or teachers live under the onerous demands of two types of federal policies. On the one hand, they need to differentiate and ensure students with special education diagnoses receive the best open and fair education they can, which requires many times differentiating instruction and outcomes. And at the very same time, they have to standardize outcomes and get everyone to pass a test. So there is so much space here for us to go in and interrogate, how is this playing out? How can we use what we know about good instruction, good learning, good motivational practices that can assist teachers to navigate this very complex set of laws and demands? Of course, well, and the other area is teacher preparation. We know anecdotally that pre-service teachers go through teacher preparation programs learning how to teach, and yet they go into the real life classroom and they don't get to do those types of things. And so particularly for our new teachers, how do we rectify this very different set of expectations from their teacher preparation experiences to what they may face in the classroom? So we really don't know how teachers in different contexts are handling this situation, or when they deal with different types of students, how it changes or might influence their teaching, their classroom management processes, their feedback systems on tests, their beliefs about assessments, feedback, and student motivation. Of course, it's not just national, and this is just a selection of some of the national policies that I have been thinking about. There are other national rules and laws, but there are also state and local rules and laws that are equally powerful in dictating or laying the groundwork for how teachers should operate in the classrooms. Could be things like homework policies, local discipline policies. I put up here state-defined accountability systems because although there's this national law, there is such diversity in how everything gets implemented. And we don't really know all the ways that diversity plays out. And state by state has defined how they will implement their accountability system quite differently. So there's a lot of spaces here to interrogate and to take our expertise to understand how these things play out. So I also think why we need to do this, it's sort of a moral obligation, moral imperative, if you will, because the quality of students and teachers' lives are at stake because of all I have witnessed under high-stakes testing and the damage it has done. It's really inspired me to feel quite passionate about how important it is that we use our knowledge and skills in whatever way that moves us to try to help improve the situation. Interestingly, this is our 125th anniversary. It's APA's 125th anniversary and our discipline as well. It's been over 100 years. So there's been a lot of folks reflecting on what we should be doing as a scientific community. Garrison, DeLeon, and Smedley in The American Psychologist, in such a reflective essay, argue the purpose of APA as a professional organization is dedicated to the application of scientific knowledge in the interests of human welfare. And as such, it is committed to take an active position on any public policy or issue which jeopardizes these fundamental scientific and professional goals. APA as a larger organization has been doing more over time to step out and advocate for and against laws, legislation that are damaging. The immigration situation, APA has made a statement about weapons in schools and gun safety. APA has made a statement about. So, and AERA has been doing this as well. So we see these professional organizations also sort of ramping up efforts to use the scientific knowledge that we have to be more involved in the conversations about what is good policy. But more locally to us, as it relates to education issues, Jeannie Oakes, past president of AERA, she made a similar call. For research to matter, that is to better society and schools, it must escape the ivory tower and engage in the public sphere. The public and policymakers need coaches, guides, collaborators, and translators to make such knowledge accessible and usable. So we really are at an opportune time, given all that's going on legislatively, in education, and in other arenas, for us to not be silent and employ our skills, again, in ways that make sense to us, to be more involved, to help inform policy, influence policy, or even just educate on issues of policy. So, how do we do this? Here's the million-dollar question. I have heard a lot of ideas for how we should do this and what we should do. People have a lot of thoughts on this, and there's a lot of great things we can do. It's one thing for an individual to come up with a personal plan, meaning, individually we can all make decisions to get more involved in local and state politics. We can go to our legislative sessions. We can try to influence politicians' thinking on education issues. But we also know this isn't easy. It's time consuming. Many of us don't really know how to even go about this. So rather than trying to problem solve that complexity, my approach here is to offer some ideas that I think might be somewhat more manageable or doable. And in doing so, maybe it opens doors for the more difficult work of engaging with politicians, having those conversations. So when thinking about our community of scholars and offering the ideas, it's difficult because we are so diverse. We have different needs, we have different goals, trajectories, we're at different places in our careers, we have different values. But still, I hope these sets of things to think about might be helpful to continue to move the dial a little bit on this area. So one thing I'm going to talk about is the type of research we might do. I mean, that is something under our relative control, right? We can ask particular types of research questions and interrogate certain issues. So I'm going to provide some thinking on that. Emanating from that, of course, is the type of designs we employ that can help maximize what we learn from these elements. An even simpler way to be involved is just to make the case. And as we'll talk about, or I'll share, there's a section in every article that we write that is about implications. And I would argue that almost all of our work has some kind of implication to how we might think about policy. It may not be direct, but it can at least offer some ways to think about it. And then some thoughts on how we might disseminate our thinking and do more outreach. Okay, so let's start with the how. How do we do this? So one thing I think about is through the type of research we conduct, right? The type of research questions we ask. A lot of policy analyses focus on large-scale data that underscore trends, correlations between school finance or academic outcomes or poverty status, educational outcomes, things like this. What I've come to learn is educational psychologists are in a very unique and powerful position to apply psychological expertise to better understand the underlying processes of these trends, how they play out in different contexts, how they play out with different populations, different types of teachers. Again, teaching is complex, and so policy analyses that tend to look at linear correlational types of relationships are very interesting and useful, but we can provide another part of the story. So what are some ways to do that? Well, questions that interrogate policy implementation. These are just a variety of examples, but this is certainly not exhaustive. Everyone, depending on your area, your discipline, you might come up with something more relevant to what you like to study. But in the policy implementation sort of area, I think that organizes one type of research approach we might take. We can interrogate how do teachers in schools with different accountability structures engage with academically diverse students? How is that accountability being implemented in different schools? We don't even really know how the pressures of high stakes testing really play out in different schools with different types of teachers. We could probably interrogate that in a more nuanced way, which could provide much more helpful information about how accountability laws are structured or written. How do teachers implement special education policies in general ed classrooms? The response to intervention policy, that is federal law, is quite diverse in how it gets implemented. It's quite diverse in how much teachers are supported in implementing it. And given its emphasis on helping the struggling learners improve, this seems like such an area that educational psychologists with expertise in learning and instruction can really help teachers. But policy implementation, how are discipline policies implemented? How are they perceived or interpreted by those that are implementing it? Just understanding implementation effects could be something we could weigh in on. Policy effects, of course, what are the outcomes of policies? What is the effect of test-based pressures on novice or veteran teachers, on students' long-term motivation, on their self-regulation? Interestingly, there has been really not a lot of studies truly looking at that connection, especially in a longitudinal fashion. What is the effect of weapons in schools on students' psychological, emotional, social development? And I bring that as an example because Division 15 just released its first policy brief on this topic. And we have a member who is doing work in this area. And this work is quite amenable to making arguments to legislators about what is good or not good policy as it relates to this topic. Policymakers, studies to understand the motivations or identities, decision-making structures of policymakers. Collectively, doing research on actual policy is one of the strongest ways we can start to have impact on policy, because if we have data, then we have something to share. We have something to talk about with policymakers about what we're learning. But it's not just the projects we could do. It's then the designs that emanate from those types of projects. And there's lots of different designs that make sense. And it certainly depends on the research question. You know, we don't start with a design, we start with the question. But I think there are certain designs that, to me, capture better the broader processes we're trying to understand, like mixed methods, comparative case studies. But other types of designs are also very useful and meaningful and can provide information to help us have policy implications. Certainly longitudinal designs, design-based research, interventions can still be relevant and are important. Again, anything that is about helping us to understand what is the policy, how is it implemented, what are the effects. So what are some other ways we might do this? One idea I have that I'm working on or thinking about really is national working research groups, creating working groups in different locations in the US to study policy implementation impact outcomes. How are students, teachers affected in these various locations? How are policies interpreted, carried out? Why not have groups of scholars interested in similar topics like motivation, learning, and zero in on certain types of policies that we know are impacting how teachers engage around learning and motivation, and try to understand what's going on. Another how sort of thing has to do with this idea of just make the case. Make the case in your research when you produce an article of what policy implications there are. I'm not saying it's always going to be obvious or relevant, but I think we as a field could possibly do a better job even on that front. And when we learn about or we're producing data on cognitive change, on teacher feedback systems, on motivational systems, what kind of policies might that connect to? I did a very informal, cursory look at two of our flagship journals, which certainly doesn't represent the scope of all the work we do. Looking at Journal of Educational Psychology, a selection from 2000 to 2015 during the time of No Child Left Behind, and similarly of educational psychologists. And there were just very few that even mentioned policy, let alone focused on policy. Again, not suggesting that maybe I missed some folks, different articles or different journal outlets. But it just seems to me that we could even be making the case or trying to privilege it a little bit. And you can see there's some graphs here that just show the distinction between how many we examined and how many actually looked or mentioned policy. And here's Journal of Educational Psychology, educational psychologist. So what are some other ways? So another aspect to informing, influencing, being part of the policy discussion is, of course, dissemination, getting it into the policy makers' hands, getting it into their thinking as they craft or carry out policies. So in addition to just doing some work that is clearly connected to some kind of policy that is of interest, we can make it explicit in our own work, our current work, wherever it makes sense. But then there are a whole host of things that we could be doing, writing editorials, using social media to disseminate the work we do. And Division 15 does a really good job of that. We have a communications expert who helps us doing that. So we're doing what we can at the division level, but certainly there are individuals who have made pretty stellar careers out of purposely being involved in social media and engaging in the policy arena. As I've talked about, one of the strongest ways to really be heard is having conversations with politicians, direct contact with local representatives or state representatives, going and have conversations, sharing your information. But again, and individual work on school boards is another area. So I think the problem or the difficulty in doing all that is it doesn't get you tenure. We know this. These types of writing activities take time, and yet it doesn't really get valued. So I'm hopeful that over time, as disciplines and the scientific endeavors, which to me seems to be slowly evolving, that maybe over time institutions will start to see the value in this work, which will help. But in the meantime, other things we can do is participate in programs to have access to Congress. AERA and APA have such programs, and there's a National Education Policy Fellowship Program, which I believe contracts with states, so you could do it through the state component of that. There's a website at the end of these slides that will be disseminated to help you find information on these. But these are other ways to get ideas, get exposure to, and to learn about the policy process. But for us, Division 15 and it's the Ad Hoc Policy and Practice Committee, with the support of the Executive Committee of Division 15, is working hard to provide support and opportunities for our members to learn how to think about policy research and how to disseminate it. So one avenue for this is we've started a policy brief program, if you will. We've released our first one, and the website is at the end of these slides if you're interested and have not seen it. But what we're trying to do is create a mechanism that will allow those who are interested to work on policy briefs and to at least start to step into that arena and conversation. As part of that, we are also preparing to have a workshop at the upcoming APA conference. It will be held Friday, August 8th from 5 to 7 p.m. We don't know where yet. We've sent out an information gathering email asking to see who's interested in this, so we know how to plan. But we have a few scholars who do this work who plan to present on how to write briefs, how to disseminate briefs, how to think about research and policy. And it will be a space for an informal conversation to get ideas. I really am interested in hearing more from our members about what you do and what are ways we can help facilitate this type of work. So to end, I guess what I'm really doing here is sort of a call to action. The evolving educational policy environment has significantly impacted teachers' professional experiences and practices. We can't get away from it. Policies are becoming more insidious, they're pervasive, they're there. And they are really the thing that dictates what teachers, administrators do, and in large measure what students experience. We, educational psychologists, are ideally suited to interrogate this intersection of policy, practice, and outcomes, to take our expertise in what we study and to try to understand what we know about that area and its relationship to practice as dictated by policy or as informed by policy. It seems time to take what we know about teaching, learning, and motivation, just to be redundant, and consider how it plays out within the educational policy terrain. I think it's also especially critical as our student population continues to diversify, because we know experiences will be diverse. And educational psychologists can work with local school contexts to understand the policy-directed constraints and affordances that directly impact teachers' work with those students. Building on that working group idea, educational psychologists can collaborate and seek to do research in different contexts, share findings, provide important policy implications to policymakers because of learning about how things play out in different areas. So by thinking about policy-informed scholarship, I believe educational psychologists can generate research that can have practical significance to practitioners and to policymakers. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to questions.
Well, thank you, Sharon, for the outstanding presentation and information there. We have had a couple questions come in, one of which is, should educational psychology programs include at least one educational policy course at both the undergraduate and graduate levels?
That's a great question, and yes, I think that would be fantastic. At the undergraduate level, I guess thinking if it's teacher preparation undergraduate work curricula, I am a strong believer that preparing teachers for work in schools should include preparing them to understand the rules they're going to have to follow. Early on, we saw new teachers under high-stakes testing. New teachers responded much differently than veteran teachers. And there seems to be this notion, and I don't have data for this, but that, you know, growing up with high-stakes testing sort of formulated a type of attitude towards high-stakes testing that was different than the veteran teachers who tended to be more resistant. Now, good, bad on either side, I think that we should prepare teachers to at least understand what it is the policies are and why they're in place, and how they could affect them. Because I think teachers need to be advocates of their profession, not just professionals, but advocates. And the best way to become an advocate is to understand what are the rules that they're being asked to abide by. So critical curriculum that at least offers exposure to policies, the educational policies we have to work under, I think would be incredibly valuable. And at the graduate level too, depending on one's professional goals, I think we have to understand the history of what public education is, how it came to be, and how it gets manifest and operationalized. I think it's a critical area, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even some of the things you mentioned about the hows, I thought were excellent suggestions. As you and I have talked, I've been participating in the education policy fellowship program this year, and that's been outstanding as well. So, as a sort of, I guess, approaching mid-career person, yeah, that's been a great way to sort of come back and get that I wasn't fortunate enough to have in my training. So it's been great as well. So highly recommend looking into those programs for folks. So kind of related question came in here. How might one go about finding an education policy focused postdoc?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure if APA and or AERA, the policy division of AERA, there might be opportunities that are advertised there that would be a place to look for it. Otherwise, any other, just to work with a scholar who's doing this work and is offering a postdoc through the natural listservs would be another way. But I think, and there might be federal programs that are offering these types of postdocs. I'm not sure, but that's a really good question. That'll be a really good way a good opportunity should they exist. But again, I think that organizations might offer something in that area. Yeah.
A couple more questions here. Any suggestions for how to shift the incentive structures in academia to promote more focus on the translational aspects of research for both policy and practice?
Become an administrator and change the rules. Yeah, that's a tough one. That's something that's going to take time, I think, through, as generations shift and become more interested in this. I'm kidding, but sort of not. That as we progress through our careers, the folks with tenure and who become more leaders can be the ones to advocate for this and to start that shift. I think as a new professor, that's probably harder to do. But I'm very optimistic in what I've seen, what I've heard, and where it just feels like the fields are going. I really, there's this sense that people are striving more and more to have purpose and impact. And a career of publishing for each other is fine, but I think there's some itch for it to shift a little. So part of that also is possibly new journals that will allow for this. That may be happening. Can't really say a lot about that because I'm not sure, but if we have a journal that caters to this kind of work and that purposely seeks out this work, that at least provides the pipeline for that to be more supported. But that is a tough one right now.
One question here. Unlike school psychology, educational psychology doesn't have a direct presence in school districts often, which can limit the communication to educators. Any suggestions on how you might overcome that?
Yeah, I think that's good, and I personally struggle with that too. It is hard getting entrance to schools, and it takes, there's hoops and all sorts of things. But I think to do this work, it really does ask us to form relationships with teachers and administrators. Because I think one way we identify the things that we might want to look at, particularly at the local level, is we go to schools and you just introduce yourselves and you ask, what policies are you interested, what things are going on here that you want to understand? I can help you. And that would be one way to start that relationship, and then also help to identify a topic that has practical significance. And then from there, and especially if you're starting at ground zero, that could expand to looking at other locations. So I think part of this is doing some groundwork with schools, with personnel, to formulate those relationships so you can identify the areas that you can be of assistance in looking at. You're right, we don't have an automatic presence, but I think that doesn't stop us from anytime I've introduced myself to a principal or a school or a superintendent or a teacher, and I just say, what can I help you understand more about here? There's always answers, and they always have policy relevance. I want to know about bullying. We do this, help me with bullying. We have bullying with girls, but not with boys. Help me with that. So there's definite, I think there's a rich tapestry of things to look at if you'd have to do the work to generate those relationships, I think. Yeah.
I've wanted for a year or two to integrate something like that in some of my classes, reaching out to schools and be a course project that we focus on for students and from an educational psychology background. So you're giving me motivation to get that done rather than keep talking about it. Another question How should a reviewer of journal articles respond or react to manuscripts that do describe policy implications? Specifically in the conclusion sections.
Positively? No. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, except to say it's like anything. Does the implication make sense? Would be first, order of evaluation. Is it just being thrown in there, or is it actually rooted in the questions and the data that are described in the article? But as I'm talking out loud and thinking about this, another thing might be to push writers to really talk about the policy part if it's not there. Again, it's hard for me to comment, in sort of global terms, because everything's different. Not everything's going to really be amenable to this, but certainly some areas are more so than others. And so I think reviewers can be looking for that, looking at the quality of that.
That's a follow-up here. How should, when policy implications are expressed, might you evaluate them for quality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it might require reviewers to ensure they understand the policy that's being referenced. It could mean, more work for the reviewers to be able to evaluate the quality of it. I think because I think implications don't always have to be so specific and direct, I think there's a larger bandwidth of tolerance for how you talk about policy. Because I'm not suggesting that we have to say, okay, now do this or don't do this. I'm saying that implications tend to be more framed as policymakers should think about this outcome when crafting a policy on X, because this outcome is possible. It's that kind of language that I tend to think about when we're taking a single data set and trying to sort of say what all it can do, because we know our data can't do all, can't answer everything, can't do everything. So I'm not suggesting that then we turn around and just say, so therefore, this policy is fantastic. No, our data doesn't allow for that kind of summary conclusion. So I guess understanding what the policy is and understanding if the connection just makes sense is the first level. But I'd have to think more about that. I think that's a good question.
Okay. What are some strategies for identifying policy relevant research topics or questions?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Again, one way is to go to the school or to the district office. And this is where I think, some of the issues of practice can be more directly addressed by going directly to schools or districts and asking, what are the intractable problems here? What are some things you want to better understand that we can work together and learn about? So I think that's certainly a mechanism. But one could also look at the national landscape and hone in on some kind of policy that's relevant to whatever area you're interested in, and sort of look for questions that haven't been answered or addressed. But it's really the local contact that I think would be a very powerful way to start.
Do you have any thoughts about policy in non-Western countries, such as Asian countries, and any experience in those, and how that might be something that educational psychologists could get, internationally involved with?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of experience with that, except for, reading. There's a lot of cross-cultural type of stuff on testing. I've worked with colleague in New Zealand. We kind of have had conversations about cultural differences in testing. So I have just a little bit personal, but I think that's absolutely a useful area of inquiry, whether it's taking a deep dive in a particular culture and understanding what's going on there, or doing a comparison type of an approach. I think all that could be very useful and informative and worthwhile.
So about out of time here, so maybe a last question here. Bringing it back to U.S. here, federal education policy seems to be changing, pulling back the role of government and regulations in education. So what do you think might be some effective ways to impact, and what are the most impactful sort of level of policy right now?
Well, what I've learned from my look at No Child Left Behind before things changed is, even though that was a national policy, the implementation was quite variable. It was fascinating because, having not been a policy person, you sort of don't think deeply about it. You say, oh, there's the rule, so everyone follows the rule. But boy, there's so much room for interpretation, and therefore implementation, and therefore outcomes. And so, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the follow-up to No Child Left Behind, the federal government did pull back on some of its constraints and demands on the states, but still most states are continuing to employ high-stakes testing accountability as a part of their system. So all that means is there's just possibly more variation in terms of how things ultimately feed down into the individual school. So I don't think that there is one level that supersedes another. I'm almost starting to think more and more that the local level is a powerful place, certainly to start, if not stay, because it's really how the local conditions and how the local conditions respond to whether it's a national law, state law, or a local law, that is of importance, and I think is where we can really provide some high quality information about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing we've been learning this year in the Ed Policy Fellowship, about how local school boards and school improvement councils can really be the ones affecting policy. So you can really get involved at the local level and have a big impact. So, well, thank you, Sharon. It looks like we've covered all the questions that have come in. I really appreciate your presentation today and covering this important topic of education policy and linking it to our scholarship and activities as educational psychologists. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Nichols, and I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.